Hello, my name is Mahtab Mahboub. I'm a contributor to the Amargi and your host for this interview with Shirin Khayambashi. Thank you very much, Shirin, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Mahtab, for inviting me. This is an honor and privilege to be here. And I'm really excited to talk about this very important topic. So go ahead.
You are an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. You teach sociology there and research on the experience of migration and diasporic lives. Your areas of expertise are Islamophobia, race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, Iranian diaspora in particular, immigration, and new immigration destinations. Um, we met actually in June 2025 in a conference titled Iranianness in Flux. So how Iranianness has evolved through Genjian Azadi revolutionary movement. And there you talked about feminine sexuality and gender in the context of Jina revolutionary movement. Um, I would like to ask first if you see a difference between the current wave of protests in Iran and what happened back in 2022.
So certainly there is a difference in the protest and the cause of the protest. Because looking back at it, back in 2022, the movement was really fueled by the challenge, the gendered issues. So part of the discussion began with the hijab mandate and clothing restriction that was happening. And of course, as a use of such expectations, women were subjected to violence, women were subjected to abuse, and very sadly, many women were killed in the process. And we could see why everything began. It began with Mahsa's passing, which was a tragic event for Iranian all around the world. And that began like a complete discourse surrounding the movement, as part of the discussion was the gender apartheid that was happening in Iran, which is a huge problem. Women do not have the freedom of any sort. A woman, if she wants to leave the country, if she wants to leave her house, she needs her husband's permission in many ways. Yes, we do have a lot of men who are considered to be liberal minded, but when you have this power imbalance, you always are in the state of oppression. So there is no certainty into your safety and security. However, the recent movement began as an economic issue. The recent movement began as a movement that started in the bazaars of Tehran with a single man doing a sit-in. Maybe it's my ignorance, but I still don't know the name of that unnamed man. And if you know it, I would be more than happy to know more about him. But the movement began as a form of response to economic challenges that were taking place in Iran. And that has to do closely with the sanctions that are imposed by US and foreign powers. And of course, I'm not going to deny the fact that Iran's government is extremely problematic. Iran's government is definitely in a situation and position of power that does not allow for its civilian to have normal lives. This recent movement, however, got a second wind that was encouraged by Reza Pahlavi. Reza Pahlavi is the heir to the throne of the Pahlavi dynasty. And there are a lot of discussion when it comes to this because while he gave series of promises to people of Iran, the promises were not responded to. And he promised to have the people's back, which unfortunately he didn't have that power. And sadly, as a part of this discussion, that when we look at it, he demanded help and support from the enemies of Iran, which, if you look at it, like US and Israel, he reached out to them for help. While we are aware currently that there are certain bans on Iranians currently in US and the ICE movement that is happening. So the anti-immigration movement in US is creating a very questionable ally for the Iranian community, especially when we have heard of people who were refugees and were basically deported from US. So I don't
That
think
is
US
happening currently now as we speak, as the protests are going on and there are executions happening.
100%, 100%. So looking at this is not the best. These people are not the best allies, but unfortunately, people still really relied on his support. They hit the streets, and we have seen the horrors. There was the digital blackout that the whole purpose for the digital blackout was to bring complete censorship to the voice of people of Iran. And I completely understand this has become this collective trauma for all Iranians. Suddenly, Iranians outside of Iran were responsible to become the voices of people in Iran. But unfortunately, already in the diaspora, there was a divide, there was a gap, there was a kind of misunderstanding of who we are providing support for. And that became a whole issue on its own. But during the digital blackout, I would talk to many of my Iranian friends. I have families back in Iran. I would talk to many of my Iranian friends who literally, one of my friends called me sobbing, saying, I haven't talked to my mom for like now a week now, and I literally don't know how my family is doing. I had a student approaching me, sitting in my office, crying and saying, I don't know what's gonna happen. I don't know where I'm heading. I think she had like one of my students actually had a younger sister. And she was like, I'm sure my sister hit the street and I don't know if she's alive or not. So all of these create this collective trauma. So I understand why Iranians felt the need to have a new voice, to have something to address this collective trauma. And that voice, in part, became the voice of Reza Pahlavi, which I guess I
So
would give more answer on that.
inter since inter-diaspora dynamics is also an area of your expertise, how do you see I would like to ask first if you see any difference in the diaspora residing in the US and Canada, maybe, and those in Europe, because as far as I have witnessed, at least the waves of people hitting the streets in protest in Europe has been somehow different from those in the US and in Canada.
Very good question. So I have noticed a very similar trend that in Europe we see more of a protest for the people. There is a monarchist section to it as well. But in Canada and US, we have seen a very strong monarchist movement. It's so interesting. One of my colleagues was saying that every time I want to talk about what is happening in the current situation, I have to talk with footnotes. I have to explain where I'm standing, how I'm against the regime of Iran, how I'm just questioning like some of the challenges that are happening. And that questioning has become a very big problem. And this was something like I did a research earlier on back in 2019, which you're aware already. It's about the Iranian flag. And while I was doing the research, it caused a huge concern for me because I began to notice a form of far right radicalization of the second generation, which wasn't like earlier on presented in works of, for instance, Neda Maghoulee. Neda Maghoulee talked about the second generation Iranian, and one of the discussion was the discourse surrounding Islamophobia. And she claimed that even though like the older generation are still showing the signs of Islamophobia and in part very pro-monarchist, westernized attitude toward the Iranian government and toward the Iranian identity, the second generation do not have the same inclination. However, while I was doing my research, I
Can
noticed
I
this.
ask quickly when was her research for people who are not following Iranian studies?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, her research was from, I want to say it was published back in 2018. So her research was around from 2016 to, it was around 2016. But still, I can double check and let you know after
Hmm.
the talk. We can post it. So but what I noticed when I was doing my research, I began to notice that there is this nationalist movement among the Iranian communities. The use of Iranian culture, the use of the language of pride. And I enjoy the fact that people were proud in their own culture and identity, but that pride that they were referring to had this very westernized, Islamophobic, and rather far right attitude, which can be a bit questionable as we can see it in the present time when the movements were happening during the protests. And the protests were dominated by the monarchist movement,
I would
even
like
though we
to
were,
step back to ask shortly
yeah,
about, can you tell us about your research? Because as far as I know, there are really few researchers that have focused on this very controversial symbol of the
mm,
flag in Iranian movements, which has been a case of controversy as far as I remember since 2009 with the
yes.
with the green movement and then removal of the symbol in the middle. So we have just a white.
I'm gonna go. I will explain all of this, and I am excited to talk about that because when you look at the flag of the Iran, it's a very interesting flag with a deep history. The original flag, like the mythology behind the flag, goes back to like the mythology of the flag of the first flag of Iran, which is Daraf Shekavian, goes back to the story of Kaveh, who was I'm sorry, what was it? Um,
Aaron
I'm sorry.
Smith?
Yes, yes. So he was an ironsmith, and what happened was we were talking about the king of the time that was Zahak, who was gifted a pair of serpent on his shoulder by Ahriman, which is kind of an equivalent of the devil in the Zarathustrian teaching. And what happened was this snake needed to be fed by the brain of the young and the helpless, basically. And what happened was, what do you call it? Kaveh finally was tired of this and he knew there is a leader that is going to lead the movement. What he did, he was tired of seeing his kids and other children in the area were being fed to these snake. And what happened was he eventually pulled his apron off, put it on a,
So
sorry,
turned it into a flag, basically.
basically turned it into a, I do apologize.
Okay.
A bit all over the place. So he turned it into a flag, and that became the mythology behind the first Iranian flag. So Deraf Shekavian goes back, like this is the story of the Akhmenite flag. And the Akhmenite flag had an image of what do you call it? Shaheen in the middle, which is like a hunting bird, and three circles, which refers to the do good, hear good, and say good. So this was the idea of the first flag of Iran, which is slowly evolved into future format and formation of Daraf Shekavian, and the Daraf Shekavian evolved slowly as the time process. So the introduction of the three colors and the introduction of the lion and the sun in the middle was introduced back in the constitutional revolution. So we're talking about the Enqilab Mashrute, which
1905?
1906, yeah. So
So it's
constitutional
quite
revolution,
recent.
yeah, it is quite recent. It was during the time that people were making a stand against the Qajar dynasty leaders, and they were fed up with some of the problems that were happening. And this flag was introduced as a way to represent the constitutional revolution. And this flag was in part like representative of democracy in Iran. What is interesting, there were a lot of Muslim leaders that were leading this movement. And Qajar dynasty's king at the time was like, well, you know what? Let's make this a Muslim problem, make it a Muslim constitution rather than a national constitution, which they all responded with. This is not a religious movement. It is actually a civil movement. Even though we are religious, we are going to create this new movement that is purely based on democracy, modern day democracy. But what happened is the flag was introduced, and the flag was having these colors, and the colors were introduced at the time. So the green, white, and red. The green, white, and red they're very complicated as the colors have a cultural element, they have a religious element, and they also have like a social element. So when we talk about the green color, it's the image of it's relate into the Zarathustran religion, and it's interpreted as growth and revival. So it's a matter of growth, development, and all that is in part industrious. The white color is the image, it's the color of peace and freedom. Again, it's very related to Zoroastrian religion. And also, in part, it is related to the image of peace and what is understood as uh, peace and understanding, basically. And lastly, we have the color red. The color red, for the longest time, it represented the revolutionaries who died for the constitutional revolution. This, however, evolved over time to be the representation of the any martyr who died for Iran. But eventually, this was through a series of propaganda after 1979. It was specifically associated with the martyrdom that took place during the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So the colors, however, the original colors were based on these three tenets, based on the idea of revival, peace, and the blood that was shed for the country. However, there was an idea of having an ensign in the middle. Originally, the ensign of the lion and the sun has been on other flags throughout history. We're talking about as far back as Safavid dynasty, and even Sassanid dynasty, that they did have variation of the lion and the sun on the flag. And with the Engelab Mashrute or constitutional revolution, this lion and the sun kind of lost its, in part, its personality, because originally these two images represented femininity and masculinity within Iranian culture. So the sun, which had like a very feminine figure, it was considered to be the representation of all women who are there to produce and make sure that basically the society is being built and fulfilled and cherished. And the lion was supposed to be the representation of power and representation of valor, which was associated with male and masculinity. Sorry, this was introduced, like this continued on to exist during the Engelab Mashrute, but with the change that was slowly happening during the Pahlavi era, the sun began to lose its features, began to lose its feminine features, and the lion became more and more of a ferocious creature, which on its own we can later on talk about gender definitely. So we could see there was this patriarchal growth that was happening with the Pahlavi era, which was in part closely related to what was happening with the westernization that was taking place, and specifically when Reza Shah's trip to Turkey, and he came back with a series of new ideas on how to westernize Iran. One of the discussions surrounding the flag was the change of the drafsh to parcham, because parcham is a Turkish word and darafsh is a Farsi word. And this became a whole different set of controversy, as many were arguing, like, why are we using a Turkish language? Even some people step forward to say we need to go back to the Darafshikavian and we have to get rid of these images that is not in full reality Persian. So there was this Persian movement that was kind of part of the question, and the idea of the westernization and the challenges that were presented by it. This, however, wasn't the end of the flag, because during the Pahlavi era, I want you to know one thing. There were three flags. They were not just one flag. We had the army.
Simultaneously.
Yes, yes. So we had the army flag, which had a date wreath around it. So when you see a flag with the date wreath around it and a little crown on top of it, that is the army flag. The lion and the sun, without the date wreath, it's the what do you call it? It's the national flag. And due to our very nature and we went back to our foundations, we had a flag of the people. The flag of the people that has been revived in the present time as the flag without ensign was introduced back in the Pahlavi era as something to represent the masses. And we have seen a lot of time that white space have been used over and over and over for Iranians to express themselves, because after all, the white space is this space that what do you call it? It's this space for freedom and peace. So it's not a shock to see when people change this in sign, because technically they are doing what that was given to them rightfully through other generation. However, this wasn't the end. We had the Islamic Revolution, and there was a huge debate over the flag and whether the flag should be changed. Many fought for it, for the flag not to change, because they said lion and the sun is what we are. This is what our Persian ancestry is, and we need to keep it within that cultural view. But Khomeini had his own ideas, and he argued that we cannot have a flag that is uh, representation of westernization, and the lion and the sun is all that is westernized in our country. So there was a whole debate on that, and eventually Khomeini said that we need to have like a competition to see who can introduce a new flag. And this is where the flag, the modern day flag, was introduced and was designed by Dr. Nadimi Danai. And according to Dr. Nadimi, he aimed to portray the all five tenets of Islam. And it was like everything was a creative part of my brain, which on its own had its own controversy, as many compared the Allah emblem in the middle to the Sikh emblem of Dekta Fatah. And that created a whole debate surrounding that. It's like, because I remember my grandpa used to say, like, oh, you know what? They're not technically Persian because they do have the thing that comes from the Sikh people. So it's very interesting to see how the flag of Iran is constantly evolving. And in the current movement, we do have a problematic approach to that flag use, which I'm sure you have a question on that. So I don't want to jump your questions.
Yeah, definitely. So it was a very interesting story how it has evolved and how this space for peace and freedom has that we have inherited over times has been used during this recent wave of protests. And as we spoke earlier, flag has always been a symbol that divides, but at the same time unites people. How do you see it in the recent wave of protests, especially in the diaspora? So in Iran, the lion and sun
Yeah,
flag has been used also on the street. There were two army people that used it in a metro station in Tehran. I remember they were
yeah.
taken away and the flag was snatched away from them. So in Iran, it has been used as a symbol of resistance, if I may use that word.
Yeah.
And but I think in the diaspora, the dynamic has been different.
100%, 100%. Because in Iran, and this is the problem that I had during the digital blackout, we were supposed to become the voice of the people of Iran. But unfortunately, the diaspora dominated the voice. And you could see a form of imperialist approach to changing the narrative in Iran, changing the narrative in the movement, and actually not giving the voice to the voiceless at the time. We try to control the narrative in the diaspora. So if in Iran someone uses a flag of lion and the sun, it's a sign of resistance. It's a sign of demand for change. It's a sign of demand for freedom. But when this is being used in diasporas, where we have the freedom to fly any flag, it's no longer resistance. It has different meanings. And it was part of my research that I explored the use of Iranian flag in Canada, especially like Greater Toronto area and York region. So if you're familiar with Toronto, all the region, that area, going all the way to the northern part of Ontario, like the southern Ontario is we have a lot of Iranian diaspora settling there. So one thing I explored was the representation of flag and the way it was portrayed. Because at the time we didn't have this discussion. So we had a lot of people who were recently coming to Canada and they were familiar with one flag, and that was the current Islamic Revolution, a post-Islamic Revolution flag. So we're talking about La ilaha illallah flag. And that flag did not have the right, did not get the same response from the people who were from the earlier generation, who were familiar with the flag of the Lion and the Sun. So we did see a lot of divided perception. I've noticed a lot of more critical thinkers and scholars who were kind of supporting the white flag. So the one without this ensign, they were supporting the white flag, saying, we don't want this, we don't want that, let's keep the white flag. But the Islamic Republic flag suddenly became associated with the support for Islamic Republic, which wasn't the true intention for many who were using it. That was the only flag they were familiar with. That was the flag that they were raised on there. And that was the basically the official flag of Iran. But it became an immediate sign of support for Islamic Republic. And there has been, I have talked to people, and older gentleman actually said, I'm willing to go to if I have to, which was a sign of threat. And that is not a best way to unite people.
And this is already back in 20.
2018, back in 2018, which
Because
when
that my
I
next
remember,
question was about the political violence that we are seeing
yeah,
in the protests in the diaspora, but it was already
unfortunately,
back in 2018.
this was back in 2018. And I remember I saw a couple of videos where the Islamic Republic flag was ripped in the most aggressive way without opening a conversation, without starting a dialogue. Suddenly you would see someone approach and rip the Islamic Republic flag. Some of the international students were feeling kind of insecure about, they were kind of confused. I wouldn't say it was insecurity. They were confused about what flag should represent their community. I remember there was a whole controversy in York University where Islamic Republic flag was hanged as a part of Flag Day. All the flags were in the student, what do you call it, in the student association building. And one student stepped in and she was purely angry and she started blaming everyone and basically pointing finger, which I understood her anger and frustration. I understood that she was someone who was affected by what was happening in Iran, and seeing the flag caused a lot of stress for her. But this could have been managed differently. But still, I understood her anger and frustration. I understood her anger. I remember the flag was removed very graciously and a new flag was raised, which was the white flag. And I celebrated the change in the flag. And I was kind of happy that she did that. Because Islamic Republic flag, as much as it is the official flag, it's a flag of oppression. And people do feel this state of stress and discomfort that is presented with that. But we need to have more of an open conversation because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of people who are unaware of this controversy in diaspora.
I'm very
But
curious, sorry to interrupt you. So,
no,
was there a conversation about putting up the white flag or?
yes, the conversation happened. They actually invited her to have a discussion with her. And she was like, I just don't want the Islamic Republic flag to be up there. And the flag was brought down, and eventually the white flag went up, which again, there was a conversation regarding what would be the most appropriate flag to go up, which I understood. The white flag is a flag of the people, and I expect to see more of a white flag during the protest, which this was not representative in the recent movement. First of all, we have seen like various form of aggression toward any flag that is not line in the sun. I don't know if you've seen the video of a young woman having the Zan Zandagi Azadi, Jan Jiyan Azadi uh, with her, like Woman Like Freedom flag with her, and she was attacked. She was verbally attacked. She was kind of asked to leave the space. And this is where things become divisive. Because here we are trying to bring the community together, but we are restricted on how we can represent our people back in Iran. This was one of the discussion when the protest was happening in Toronto, one of the biggest protests that took place. And it was a space for everyone joining to support and share their support for the people of Iran. But one of the discussion was like, only flag that is allowed to be here is Line in the Sun.
So
However,
you're referring to the 14th February
14th of February, yes.
Day of
Yes.
Support for the Iranian National Revolution, if
Yes.
that was the official name of the.
It
Mm.
was a call for protest and it was supposed to be for the support of the people. But unfortunately, we saw only Line in the Sun. And I wish it wasn't just Line in the Sun. One thing that really disheartened me was the representation of US and Israel flag during the movement. If we are trying to bring everyone under one flag, it should be one flag. If you're allowed to have more than one flag, everyone should be representative of their political view. And this was one of the most disheartening thing. And it was seen as a kind of a, like anyone making any claim against the Israel or US would receive serious backlash during the movement. And it caused this mass censorship and silence among the diaspora as we were no longer participating in a dialogue. We were not participating about like in a democratic conversation. It was one voice, and that one voice was becoming the dominant voice, which not a lot of people agree with. I remember I was watching a video by the queer collective of Toronto, the Seymour. One of their spokespeople said, well, a lot of people are saying you're a monarchist because you're carrying the monarchist flag. And I'm saying, no, I'm not a monarchist. I'm for the freedom of the people, but we need to be together under one flag. That is a very loaded idea, unfortunately, because we've never been under one flag. It has been given to us that we had more than one flag. Each movement carried its own flag. Even Pahlavi era that a lot of these people are supporting had three flags. And it's really difficult to navigate this movement's politics as we are seeing the contradiction. We are seeing the contradiction. And the use of violence, it was,
I would like to ask if you
yeah.
can um, name a reason for this. How would you explain this emerged? Because we had seen waves of protest back in 2022, and there were clashes on the streets also with, especially with people who had supported, let's say, reformers in Iran or the regime in Iran and had very recently moved out and were now joining the protests or the opposition. So they were mostly targeted, but now there is the monarchist fraction, and there is more or less everybody else who is being targeted. Do you have any
So
way of explaining how this came into being?
it has been bugging me for since the beginning of this movement. I have been looking at it, and one of the ways that I can explain, one of the explanation basically would be a lot of critics of the previous movement was the lack of leadership. There was a lot of criticism of there is a lack of leadership. There is a lack of leadership. The grassroots movements were seen as this movement that didn't have a trajectory, which we did see the political trajectory. However, coming from a culture and a history that encourages hierarchy, it was rather difficult for a lot of Iranians to see that a movement can actually be grassroots, can be communal. You don't need to have specifically one leader. You need to have a change that is taking place. However, that critique was very loud and clear. Many, what do you call it, many scholars, when they talked about movements, previous movements, they always talked about how there is a lack of trajectory and lack of leadership. This time, we saw it, we needed leader. And unfortunately, the only person who jumped into the line was Reza Pahlavi. He took that role of the leadership, even though we saw his call for movement, his call for protest. It just led to a lot of bloodshed, which I don't want to get into that at the moment. But a lot of people began to think that this leadership can free the people of Iran. So in part, I understand why people are kind of supporting monarchy. In part, I understand. It's that collective trauma that we don't know how to deal with it. We want to create a change. We want to bring a kind of a solution to the problem that is affecting the people of Iran. I was talking to a friend who was like, I'm tired of not being able to go to Iran for the past 6, 7 years. I haven't been able to go to Iran because I'm just genuinely afraid. It's like, I believe if we have a change, then if you have a change of government and monarchy comes into power, it's going to be amazing. And another thing is the discussion of what are the alternatives. And what are the alternatives becomes one of the questions that every time you say, why are you supporting monarchy? They're like, okay, so what are the alternatives? And I have given this answer. We have a lot of political prisoners in Iran who would be an amazing alternative. One of the people who was attacked was Narges Mohammadi, and she was attacked by the monarchists because she said monarchy is not the solution. She would be an amazing alternative, but we don't want to talk about that because we have this understanding that because Reza Pahlavi's father was the king of Iran, he should be the next king. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I feel like part of this confusion, part of this one-sided support has to do with people's exhaustion, people demanding for a change, people wanting something that is productive. And we heard this a lot. It's like, okay, let him come and take over the country. Then we're going to introduce democracy. I'm sorry, this didn't work when Khomeini came into power. I don't think it's going to work again in the present time. But that is my 2 cents.
I think that's a very um, warning, very much of a warning to end with. Um,
Yes.
I appreciate your time very much, Shirin,
Thank
and
you so much.
thank you for the conversation.
I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for giving me this platform. And I wish this dialogue keeps on going. I have nothing against the monarchists. They can believe in their political view, but we need to have a dialogue. We cannot have a one-sided shouting match. So thank you so very much for inviting
Thank you.
me.